How many people here had the luxury of being taught by Mrs. Rigsby? Remember Mrs. Rigsby? Wonderful kindergarten teacher. She was about 4'5". Just a sweetheart of a lady. It's funny what you remember of people, though. I remember her for her eye makeup. She had this bright blue. I think she shared the makeup artist with Sir Graves Ghastly or something, but sweet little lady. You know, our first day at school, I remember that. First day at school, Mrs. Rigsby wanted to have a little bit of an ice-breaking ordeal, and she wanted the kids to get to know one another, and she wanted to get to know about us. It was all very sweet, and she said, okay, what we're going to do today, children, is we're going to learn about each other. We want you each to tell a story about a family member. And it's got to be true. And you have to share with us what lesson that you got from the story. Well, my arm shot up right away. I was eager to share. But Mrs. Rigsby didn't pick me. Early surveillance, I suspect, but no, she gazed upon the classroom and she saw little Mary McCracken sitting there. Little Mary shot up her hand, and Mrs. Rigsby said, Mary, do you have a story for us? She goes, I sure do, Mrs. Rigsby. My dad, he works at the Dresden Produce. They call it the blood and gut. And one day, Mrs. Rigsby, they told my dad that he had to take a load of turkey eggs over to Tupperville, and he was in a rush. And anyway, he put all the eggs into one basket, and when he got there, some of the eggs were broken, and he only got paid for the eggs that weren't cracked. And Mrs. Rigsby said, well, that's a fascinating little story there, Mary, but I fail to see what the lesson could be in that. To which Mary replied, well, Mrs. Rigsby, I think the lesson is that you don't put all your eggs into one basket. And Mrs. Rigsby liked that. She goes, that's a great lesson, Mary. Thank you for sharing. Is there anyone else in the classroom this morning that would like to share a story? And of course, I was waving my arm like I was hailing a cab in a hurricane. And again, Mrs. Rigsby didn't pick me. No. She had to pick little Sally Jenkerson. Sally, do you have a story to share? I sure do, Mrs. Rigsby. My dad, he also works at the blood and gut. And he had to deliver eggs that were just about to hatch over to Wallaceburg. And so he loaded up his truck and went over to Wallaceburg. But you know what, Mrs. Rigsby? He got there quicker than he thought he would be. And some of the eggs hatched, but some of them didn't. And he only got paid for the eggs that hatched. She goes, oh, I'm really sorry to hear that your dad suffered, a little bit of an economic setback there, but other than that, I'm not getting the story. She goes, well, Mrs. Rigsby, I think the story is you don't count your turkeys before they hatch. She goes, oh, of course. And that's another great lesson. Johnny? Does your dad work at the blood and gut too? No, Mrs. Rigsby, Dad doesn't work at the blood and gut. Not even about my dad. She goes, oh, well, who would it be about? Family member. I said, well, this one's about my cousin Paul. Cousin Paul Weese. And a smile came to Mrs. Rigsby's face. Oh, he's such a wonderful child. You know, he's one of my favorite students. Well, tell us about the story. I said, well, I'm happy to tell the story about Cousin Paul. One day, Mrs. Rigsby, Cousin Paul had a family barbecue in the backyard, and it was a grand affair. Everybody from our family was there. Well, anyway, Cousin Paul was barbecuing in the backyard, and anyway, his cousins, Ted and Alan, were feeding him beer. Lots of beer. And you know, Cousin Paul accidentally got drunk, and this was very uncharacteristic of Cousin Paul. That's how I spoke in kindergarten. Cousin Paul got accidentally drunk, and he stumbled into the barbecue, and he knocked the hot coals all over the yard, and the food, oh, it was a mess, Mrs. Rigsby. And, you know, it was a particularly dry summer, and the grass caught on fire, and it started to spread, and it went into the gardens, Linda's beautiful gardens, and it went up the fence to the neighbors and over into the Geniac's yard, and it caught on fire. It was just an awful mess. And someone called the fire department, and good thing there was no hockey championship being celebrated that day. The fire truck was available. And so Ronnie Law and his merry men came racing down the street. My old neighbor Bob Squires was driving the truck. And Mrs. Rigsby, he hit the gas instead of the brake, and he plowed that truck right into the carport of Cousin Paul's house. And she goes, I think we've heard enough. And besides, what possible lesson could you get out of that? I said, well, Mrs. Rigsby, I would conclude that you don't screw with Cousin Paul when he's drinking. Thank you, folks.